Hello, I'm Edward Lucas. Welcome to SEPA Forum, Fit to Lead. I'm here in London in the Ministry of Defence with the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace. Secretary of State.
Hello, hi.
Thank you for joining us for SEPA Forum. We seem to be moving into a new era of defence where coalitions of agile, threat-aware, capable countries are doing things that the old security arrangements that we've got used to in the past either can't do or can't do quickly enough. What does that mean for Britain?
Well, I think first of all, what I would say is it's what foreign policies can't do quick enough is sort of what I would say, and foreign ministries around the world, and defence having to face the threat on a daily basis and think about threat first, recognises that I think often you're going to get quicker with bilateral and trilateral relationships than you are necessarily in trying to manoeuvre very large alliances into place, where there isn't already a sort of legal framework in position. So NATO has a strong, proper legal framework that you can trigger in Article 5. And remember, that was done in the 1950s. You know, I wonder if today you could set the same thing up with the whole Article 5. I wonder how hard that would be to get through international permissions, departments, cross-government relationships, internally before you get to it. I wonder. And so I think being nimble gives you an upper hand, and therefore joining with more nimble countries who share the same threat is actually going to be part of the future.
And we've seen exactly that sort of nimbleness, that agility with the new British, American, Australian deal, beginning with nuclear submarines and with lot more to come. That's left a lot of people in continental Europe saying, what does Britain still do for us? What's the British role in the defence of Europe?
Well, I think Britain's role is, first of all, we're the second biggest contributor to NATO. We both have similar to the Australia AUKUS thing, is we have a mutual and common interest in the security of Europe. You know, the security of Europe is vital for Britain and vital for continental Europe. So actually, don't be distracted by things that have gone on further afield. Britain has in history brought its young men and women to fight for it, and will continue to do so through its NATO obligations. Britain's security matters for Europe, and it is a country that is often a leader in capabilities, but also a convener of other people. So I think we do a lot for Europe, and Europe does a lot for us. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And you know, for us, of our scale, as a nation with a significant military capability, but not a superpower capability, we will need to find those partners that match in size and ability, and countries such as France are natural bedfellows for us, and France would say the same about us.
And in that Franco-German bed right now, I wonder if the relations are as completely harmonious as they've been in the past.
Look, I have a really good relationship with Florence Parly, my French counterpart. We have too much in common for the sort of media rhetoric that we've seen being talked about in comments from the side to make the deep difference. You know, whether it is the development of complex weapons through our partnerships in MBDA, whether it is sharing 40mm cannon on our Ajax and the French armoured vehicle, because our industrial bases are often overlapped. Thales UK is one of the biggest, it's a big French company, massive British employer. We have too much of that industrial base to lose, I think, for each other. We'd lose capabilities that we enjoy sharing. We have too much interest in places like Africa and the near abroad and the Middle East. We have the same enemy, ISIS. Radicalization in Africa will end up on British and French streets. We are the victim of Russian aggression, both through cyber, through espionage, and we are both in that place. And we both have something to lose from a China that, if it becomes dominant or against the way of doing things that Britain and France enjoy, we have to lose in the Pacific as well. So I think we have a lot together. We're actually quite joined at the hip.
And so far, France has done more of the heavy lifting in Africa and not done so much on the Russia side. And Britain has the enhanced forward presence deployment in Estonia and does a whole raft of other things. How do you see that British presence in what we used to call Eastern Europe developing?
I think it's developing, it'll go further, and I think it goes further for two reasons. One is your point earlier about the wider type of coalitions and the more bespoke relationship. Organisations like the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which are effectively the Scandinavian and the Nordics plus Holland and Britain, are absolutely perfect for all of us to work together on a threat in a backyard that is very intimate to us all, and with militaries and the raw material, the men and women of our countries, being off an educational standard that allow us to be a very productive armed forces and to potentially get strategically ahead of Russia's sub-threshold world. So I think in that space we have some really good opportunities to do. And then in other parts of the world, in Africa, yes, France obviously leads in places like in Mali and places like that, in Sub-Sahel. But we're there with them. We've got a squadron of Chinooks, and we've got obviously the UN MINUSMA deployment. But Ghana's not far away. And on Eastern Africa, we have obviously ambitions and partnerships with Kenya and indeed in Somalia, because for Britain, East Africa is a very key part of our security sort of bubble. And then we're both in the Middle East. So I think all round, we lift each other's weights, but we also, we definitely lean into the problems.
And if we just drilling down a bit on the Baltic, we've had a very successful enhanced forward presence with Britain and other countries in the three Baltic states and the Americans in Poland. But it's not really a full defence plan. There's no air defence, for example, for our troops there. We don't have a maritime strategy. These countries are too small to buy the sort of weapons that they would ideally need to defend themselves. How do you see that developing? Is NATO ready to go for proper defence of the Baltics, or are we still on doing so-called tripwire forces?
Well, I think the DDA work of NATO, it's really good work. I mean, I've been really impressed by it. I read it in full, and it's really about NATO moving to recognise how Russia's threat has changed, but also how readiness is important and how they have to configure. And then add that to NATO's new strategic plans that they're working on. I think we'll see that the Baltic plans that we have in the sort of, Estonia, etc., will be better coordinated and in a place that could be used if they had to in that defence. I think NATO is absolutely in the right direction now. I think Jens Stoltenberg's done a fantastic job. I think, one of the legacies of President Trump was this drive to spend money to make sure that these other NATO countries came up to 2%, that they delivered. And, many of the Baltic states are 2% and above. And I think that is putting NATO in a better position. That's going to take time, but it's definitely important that we get to that stage.
I think actually, and all the Baltic states, all three of them, and Poland, are all in the 2% club, and put the rest of some South European countries to shame on that. But if you look at the just one more question on the sort of Nordic Baltic region, the kind of backstop in terms of military mass was the US Marine base in Norway, huge quantities of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all the sort of stuff. And the worry is that although Jeff is absolutely fantastic, he'll do brilliantly for the first week and then run out of everything. And how do you think about this question of with the Russians having so much in terms of numbers and firepower and depth, and us having this sort of fundamentally quite sort of high-tech but fragile defence? Is that something that we need to rethink?
Well, I mean, I think it's not the only American hub, and I think the Americans have at another level quite invested in 5 Corps into Europe, and I think we're not seeing the Americans withdraw from Europe at all. I think if you remember, Donald Trump talked about some of those changes, but fundamentally the United States is still strongly committed to the European theatre, and I think our forces are better configured now to support that. But I also think that's a role for the United Kingdom alongside the JEF, which is, we can help in those areas. We too are investing in our German hub. We will be not putting back the forces that left BAUR, but certainly we will be investing in effectively stay-behind capabilities and some of that equipment so that we can very quickly forward base. So I think, we shouldn't think America is withdrawing in any way from Europe. It's not. It's all my discussions with my US defence counterpart, absolutely committed to it. I think there's work to be done about how can the rest of Europe come up to both the standard and the readiness that I think the US expects of its allies. And I think there's no harm in that. And Sakar is doing some great work in trying to deliver that. And the DDA is part of that.
And what's the lesson from Zapad? We've just seen the end of this quadrennial, huge Russian exercise with a seemingly rather aggressive scenario, great unclarity about the numbers of troops and what's going on. I'm sure there's masses about this in the classified space, but from an unclassified level, what conclusions can we draw from Zapad?
I think, yet again, how much premium the Russians put on readiness, and that is very important for them. And they know that readiness puts a lot of us off balance, and therefore, even though we know it's quadrennial, even though we know a lot of their exercises are very cyclical, they create a readiness that keeps people guessing, and I think that's why in our defence review I recognise the premium that it is on readiness, and that we need to change people's risk calculus about us and our forces. So I think that's the first thing about Zapad. I think the second thing is it shows that Russia configures its forces in that part of Europe for one purpose, and we have to be alert to that it certainly isn't an exercise in peacemaking. It's Zapad is a very forward-leaning scenario. Let's call it that, in a British understatement. And I think you only have to see what it does to show to your people who doubt that's what it's configured. And I think thirdly, it probably demonstrates that if we don't invest and don't modernise our armed forces and don't review our own doctrines, they will gain a strategic advantage.
The other big thing on the to-do list for NATO and the West generally is the Black Sea, which is a bit of a black hole when it comes to strategy. HMS Defender, our Royal Navy warship, had an interesting encounter with the Russians off occupied Crimea not so long ago. What lessons do you draw from that? What more do we need to do in the Black Sea?
Well, I think the lesson of the Black Sea is coordination. There are a lot of nations who are NATO nations around the Black Sea. And unlike the Barents Sea, and unlike the North Sea and the sort of North Atlantic, where there's lots of coordination between Canada, Norway, Britain, Poland, Germany, all take roles, France, there just isn't that level of coordination between all the NATO states around the Black Sea that I think would maximise presence.
And the non-NATO ones.
And the non-NATO one, and efficiencies in, uphold the rule of law, etc., that is so important. So I think that's part of it. No one owns the Black Sea, but some people behave as if they do. And I think so coordination is really the lesson of the Black Sea and Defender. I also think that, we shouldn't forget that Russia has invaded Crimea. Russia has illegally annexed Crimea and has invaded a sovereign country of Ukraine. And Britain isn't going to let people forget that.
I was a bit surprised. I was covering this quite closely, and we talk about coordination. I was a bit surprised at how uncoordinated the Western response was after HMS Defender was in this ticklish, to use another British understatement, position. And I felt that we could have done with more statements of support from everyone, from allied militaries, allied foreign offices, all sorts of people. And I felt that the Russians must have, at the end of that, thought, well, the Royal Navy is jolly tough, but they don't have much backup.
I don't know. I think there was some strong, memory serves me right, some strong comments from people like NATO who were supportive. And remember, it was a NATO as such deployment, and we were there with a Dutch ship, which, funnily enough, had horrendous harassment, I think, almost 24 hours later, and was nowhere near the same part of the sea we were in. And I think, if Russia wanted to score an own goal, they probably did with Holland. So I think, I didn't get a sense of lack of support. I got a sense that Russia will seek to use lots of propaganda around an event like that Ukraine knows it has its friends, and we're going to stand by the Ukraine. And I think it showed to other members in NATO, if they ever doubted, they don't need to.
But a final question. You just mentioned propaganda, and of course the war of words and the war on the truth is absolutely central to what both Russia and China are doing. And this is something that it's not, traditionally our armed forces have not been in Western countries front and centre on this. We've left it to our diplomats or to our intelligence agencies or government information agencies or whatever. But this is changing the whole face of warfare, isn't it? If we win the battle of the narrative, then we need to win the battle on the ground.
It's one of the main planks of sub-threshold engagement, let's call it. And it is absolutely the case that we are not good enough at strategic comms. We are good at sort of soft comms, press releases and campaigns, and this is us going from A to B. I don't think we think about it deeply enough about how we place it and to which audiences we're talking about. So this is, I think the dividing line that will absolutely be between the West, NATO and Russia, for example, is the truth. Fundamentally, I know I brandish that in some sort of big word, but fundamentally, we don't make things up, but what we don't do yet is strategically push important facts that allow people to challenge narratives that are peddled, that are false. And, I think that's important. I think we're not as smooth or slick as we could be in it, because as you say, it's not really been our, Britain, I can only speak for the United Kingdom, we're not as good as we could be at it. And I think that's the work we're going to do. We are good at overt campaign, today is whatever week it is, shipbuilding week, we can do all that sort of thing. But sometimes we talk to ourselves rather than talk to the right audiences. And I think I find it really interesting the amount of resource we put into telling British people that we're helping countries in the Caribbean, for example. But how much time do we spend the people in the Caribbean letting them know that we're helping them with aid and support? And that's where we're not as good as we could be.
We used to be better at it, but certainly in terms of audiences and messaging, we couldn't ask more as the SEPA audience than the messages that we just had from the Secretary of State, Ben Wallace. Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Goodbye from London.